I'll point you to the handout, and we'll be using this today. The best way now, I think, is to go on by example, rather than me trying to say this is the pattern or this is the formula. However, the handout yesterday did give a series of patterns, that where you use the tla or the yuk together with dim, they always occur before a transitive verb. That's what this top batch of 3 right here are. And the order is something like sayuk nidim ga'a, sayuk nidim ga'a, or sayukandim ga'a. You'd normally abbreviate it there. Or you could just say slandim ga'a or slaniga'a. In other words, this first batch right here is a pattern that, if you follow, tells you how to put the words together. That sla has to come before yuk. You can't say yuk sla. That sla has to come before dim. You can't say dim sla or dim yuk. And the pronoun in here has to come before the verb. And by the way, you could write V self-transitive there if you wanted. But essentially, this is the pattern for the different pronouns. And you notice these are what we call Series 1 pronouns. Series 1 pronouns. We've had Series 2 and Series 3. You know, the pronouns that occur in this slot right here are the Series 2. The pronouns that occur in this slot are Series 3. These are for transitive verbs now. And the pronouns that occur here before the verb in the front, towards the front of the sentence, are the Series 1 pronouns. And basically they are, for first person singular, it's ni, but sometimes abbreviated. We don't say nidim, but ndim, yuk ndim, rather than yuk nidim, unless you're being very slow and careful. Me, often abbreviated to just a there. If that's the second singular, it means the same thing as nin. And then ti, which is the third person pronoun, and it can be either he, she, it, or even them, but I'll show you that them is a little bit different. Instead of nun, or, you know, the hard M suffix for we in the dependent order, you have dip. West Smithers. You know, we've just come to Smithers. We've just gotten there. That dip, by the way, means we. It's not the same dip like in Dip Bruce. You know, it just sounds the same but has a different meaning. And for nisim, the pronouns are different, but it's misim. You see, me is the same as the me here, and the sim tells you that it's plural. And quite often in imperatives, instead of telling somebody, well, if you tell one person, you know, get it, good. But if you're talking to several people, you know, you guys get it, sim good. That sim means you plural. It's not the same sim as in siman or so forth. So it's a different sim. This sim right here tells you that the me is plural. And if you have a det, or if you have third person plural in the dependent order, the T part goes over in front of the verb, and you maybe have something in here, and then the verb on the end of it has det on it. So I saw them shoot it. I saw them shoot it. Guy went guchtit. Guchtit. Where you see I have my dependent order is wind, then my transitive verb, then my deed right here that tells me that it's third person plural transitive subject. If you look down at the very bottom pattern, this should be changed for Western speakers, that where I have will written right here for Western people, it's win. But this essentially gives you the pattern that if you have win, it's nidim win guch, or ndim win guch, midim win guch, or midim win guch. I'll put a T pronoun on it to tell you that I'm shooting something there. But if it's he did it, it's went gucht, or went guchtit, he shot them. If I have a first person plural, it's dim win gucht. If it's second person plural, it's missim win gucht. And if it's third plural, went guchtit. There. Now, in other words, these are different patterns. The top one is the pattern you use if you have sla or yuk together with dim. The middle one is the pattern you use if you have ne together with d, ne, nendim di, guch. You know, I didn't shoot it. I won't shoot it. Nemdim de gucht. You won't shoot it, and so forth. And then at the bottom, with will or win there. This is some of the more complicated features of the language to describe, but it's complicated only to a linguist or in trying to describe it, because we're talking about a pattern of syntax that is very, very different from English. I don't know of any other language in the world that uses these particular patterns. It's what's unique about Samalgich and what makes it of particular interest to linguists. But for people who are good full speakers of the language, you just do it automatically without thinking. But to say something about younger speakers, I've noticed that many younger speakers have trouble with the dependent order and will often use the independent order, where you should be using the dependent order.
You could use for questions or
Yeah, you use the dependent order, by the way, you quite often use for questions if you have ne at the beginning of the word. But if we, what I was saying earlier about younger people using the independent order, if you look back, you know, to this prayer that we use, how's it? Oh, dip we tisum toyachsin. The dip there is we tisum very much toyachs, and the in there is you singular. But if you look back to the way we were writing at the very beginning, it was something like we tisum toyachs num nin, where no, it was we tisum toyachs sitim nin, where we were using an independent order phrasing rather than a dependent order phrasing. So that the point of this is that I think in preparing materials and in working with younger speakers who already know the language but want to perfect their control of the full grammar, you want to give some patterns that have the dependent order in it. And it's a mistake, there's mistakes that I often make. This morning, for example, when I used nidit rather than putting det at the end of that verb cats, I was using an independent order phrase rather than a dependent order phrase. I can see some of you still have, you're a bit puzzled, but I think you're beginning to catch on that there's two ways of arranging the noun phrases and pronouns with respect to the verb. The independent order, which is the one that gets used quite a bit, particularly the first sentence you speak in a discourse, will be an independent order quite often. But when you put a sentence inside of a sentence, or if you use sla or yuk, then you go into the dependent order. Does anybody have any questions right now before I move on?
Win and will, that's your choice. Or you could use either one, will, could be.
No, the win and will mean the same thing as a part of speech. It's very similar to English that, I saw that command, shot a deer. But win is the Western Gitksan form, and will is the Eastern Gitksan form. Notice that in the village names over here, it's not Gitwilkach, but Gitwinkach. Gitwinskul, not Gitwilskul, which would mean the same thing, but it would be using an Eastern kind of phrasing rather than Western. Okay, well, what I want to move on to now, the new material, is what I call, it's a general phenomenon in the language called focusing. Yes?
These are what you call the prosthetics.
Yes, Phyllis, these series 1 pronouns are proclitics. Proclitics. They're like prefixes, but proclitics are special kinds of prefixes where their positional order is a little bit, is not as fixed. Say they can attach to a dim, or to a ne before, or to a d. Proclitics are prefixes that can attach to several different parts of speech there. But I want to talk now about focused sentences, and I'll give an example or two from English, and then we'll move into some Algen. We talked before how you can break sentences down into constituents, like an English sentence, I ran, consists of two constituents, I, which is the subject, and ran, which is the predicate, and it happens also to be an intransitive verb. It's possible in English to take any constituent of the sentence and to focus it, and English has a particular way of doing it. So if I have a sentence such as I ran, I can focus the I right here and change it into I was the one who ran. Or in Irish English, or in some kinds of English, you can focus the ran and say it was running that I did. It was running that I did. But see, where you take a constituent from in the basic sentence, what we might call the basic sentence there, and you focus it and say, I was the one who ran, or another way of focusing it would be, it was me who ran. it was me who ran. And if somebody asks a question of you, who ran? It was me, or just me is an appropriate answer in English. Similarly, if you have sentences like the man shot the deer, in English you could say, it was the man who shot the deer. You could focus the deer, you could say it was the deer that the man shot. It was shooting that the man did to the deer, which sounds a bit strange, but I mean, you know, you can do that. There are exactly the same kind of sentences in Somali where you focus a constituent of the sentence, and we'll see the thing they all have in common structurally is that whatever it is in the sentence that you want to focus on, you know, to focus attention on, you move it from wherever it is in the basic sentence, put it at the very front. Put it at the very front. But after you put it at the front, you may have to do some rearranging of what comes after. You may see your basic sentence will be in the independent order, but quite often when you focus something, you put it at the beginning of the sentence, then you have to change what comes after and put it into the dependent order. Well, let me move through these focused sentences by giving examples first of basic sentences, and showing you then, or not showing you, but then looking at the pattern for the focus part. If we take, and the importance of these sentences is not just to tell you that, you know, Somali has focused sentences, but if you want to speak the language fluently and correctly and appropriately, you need to use the focused constructions. One thing that I realized the other night I hadn't been telling you, I just take it for granted, is for the most part in doing grammar in here, we've been thinking of grammar as just the proper way to put words together to make grammatical sentences. And if you're a speaker of the language, you have knowledge of its grammar. But people don't go around speaking any old sentences in any old place in any old time, but rather part of learning to speak a language fluently, part of gaining what you might call full command of a language is learning what the rules for speaking, for using sentences appropriately are. You know, in English there are many different ways to tell somebody, you know, get me a drink. It would be, I'd like to have some water. Please give me a drink. All of those have basically the same meaning in terms of they indicate you want a drink, but you use them according to whether you're talking to a stranger or your wife or a friend or whatever. Well, the point about it is that in Somali, for example, questions, when somebody asks questions, we'll see are always focused. Questions are always focused, and the proper answer to a question in Somali is not to use a basic sentence, but is to use a focused sentence that, you know, gives the information that the speaker, that the questioner has asked for, and I'll give some examples of this later. But if we take just a simple sentence like Bach ni I ran, and I want to focus the ni'i right here, and it is an intransitive subject. Bach is an intransitive verb, so ni'i is a series 3 pronoun, the intransitive subject. And I want to focus it, so I put it at the beginning. Can I say, we can say Bach ni'i. Can I say ni'i Bach? No, broken Indian. I have to do something to it. Niishbahat, or niishbachat, young people might say, or just niishbat. Or I am the one who ran. I'm the one who ran. This, by the way, technically is what's known as an intransitive subject relative clause, a relative clause formed on an intransitive subject. Some of you people who've done linguistics will recognize that term. Will recognize that term there. And I'll give you some examples of this in the prayer that we're using there. I'm the one who ran. How about Mary will have a child, or Mary is going to have a child? Dim. How about our basic sentence here? Dim scoot, Mary. Okay, Mary will have a child, our basic sentence. And we want to say, it's Mary who will have a child. It's Mary who will have a child. Can I say, Mary dim scoot? Or to Mary dim scoot? No, something is wrong there. To get our focused sentence, we'd have Mary dim scootwit. Scootwit. Notice we have vowel T there, and here we have vowel T. Where we're making a relative clause out of an intransitive subject, you put vowel T if the stem ends in a consonant, and just T if it ends in a vowel. So, dem scoot Mary, Mary will have a child, Mary dem scoot. Mary is the one who will have a child. See, we've focused on Mary there. Let me ask you about this one. Can I say, if I want to say, this one's dry, gualqutunsa. Gualqutunsa. This one is dry.
That's Mary's. Doesn't sound right.
Am I leaving something, putting something in? Would you rather just have it as Mary dim?
You would.
How many, is there anybody here who has to have sl in there? Okay, see,
it's Mary.
Yeah, it's different. Okay, well, there's a difference amongst people here, and I'll indicate that in my notes. But gualqutunsa, how about to focus if I want to say, this is the dry one. This is the dry one here. How about tunk gual gwit sa? Where you see the sa, I leave back here. The gual, the verb, I put the vowel T suffix on it. And I take the tune and put it at the very beginning. Tune gualgwitsa. This is the one that's dry. This is the one that's dry. These forms like bahat and skushwit and gualgwit are what are called intransitive relative clauses, and they're used in focusing. They're used in focusing intransitive subjects, but you use them all the time in the language. If we look at the first line of the prayer, it's Gitksan, which is an independent order construction, and then you say Nguadim lutad timlacha. We don't say lutad nin timlacha there, which is an independent order sentence, but we say lutad timlacha. Our Father, who is the one who lives in heaven. Or in the second line, Gitksan, independent order, and then what do you toyachs him for? To limit. Limit the ones that are singing. It's not lim nidit, they are singing. The limit there is an intransitive relative clause. Or again, Gitksan as hon lulot timax, the lulot timax, the lulot, the ones that live in or that are in the water. We wouldn't say lulo nit timax. We wouldn't use an independent order pronoun there. Let me give one more example of this, and I'll use my son's name. Here I could say simply Bach. Bachtmark, or better perhaps Bachtmark, where I leave the R out and pronounce it in the Gitksan way. Mark is running, or Mark ran. But one way of focusing that is to take Mark, say, Mark's the one who's running, so I can say Mark Bahadist. Mark's Bahadist. It's Mark who's running, or Mark is the one who's running. Now, the point I want to get at is a sentence like Mark Bahadist. Normally, you wouldn't just use that at the beginning of a paragraph or of a conversation. But a sentence like that really is appropriate to answer a question, like if somebody asked me, Nashkai Bahadist goes do lahani sit, who's that running over there on the playing field? I wouldn't say Bacht Mark. It's, it's true, yeah, Mark is running, but that's not an appropriate answer to that question. The appropriate answer would be Mark's Bahadist. So again, in preparing materials for teaching, it's often good not to give just isolated sentences. See, when you're first teaching people, new language learners, or say young people who want to move on to get full control, you might start with these simple sentences, but then later move to sequences of questions plus answers. Because the questions, you have to use the focus construction, but to answer a question appropriately, you have to give a focused reply back to it. Focused reply. Let me move on just briefly before we take our break. We saw here what you do to focus an intransitive subject. Let's see what you do when you focus a transitive object. When you focus a transitive object. And from what we've seen in the language so far, transitive objects and intransitive subjects get treated the same way. You use series 3 pronouns for them in independent order, and series 2 in the dependent order. But we'll see that transitive objects focus in a quite different way from intransitive subjects. But take a sentence such as this. Gub ich anash. I ate the bread. I ate the bread. If you want to focus bread, you could also focus the I, and we'll do that later on. Well, we won't get to it today, we'll do it tomorrow. If you want to focus the bread, you know, if somebody says to you something like a guishguben or gushguben, I wouldn't say gubi ich anash as a reply. I'd say anash gubi. You simply, to focus a transitive object, you just put it at the beginning of the sentence. Then you need the shl following it because you have a non-proper noun, basically a common noun. Anash gubi. It's bread that I, what did you eat? What did you eat? It's bread that I ate. It's bread that I ate. And this gubi right here, this gubi right here is also a relative clause, but it's a relative clause that is formed, it's a relative clause that is formed on a transitive object, not on an intransitive subject. Again, look at our prayer. It has one of these in it. Toyoch nin as winech gubim. Not as gubim winech. You know, you don't use the independent order there. But we thank you for the food we eat. Toyoch nin as winech gubim. Where winech gubim is it's a focus structure, but that gubim means what we ate. It doesn't mean we ate it. You know, if it just say gubim by itself, it means we ate it. But, you know, put together with other words in a sentence, it means what we ate. It's a relative clause. A few more examples of this to reinforce the pattern. To reinforce the pattern, I shot a bear. Well, let's say you shot a bear. Go and, to vary things, go and smash. Go and smash. Somebody asks you, goose gooin, what did you shoot? Can you reply back? Go is smash? No, you'd have to reply back with a focused structure. And remember, to focus a transitive object, all you have to do is put it at the beginning of the sentence with the shl connective, and then leave the verb inflected where it is. Smech gooin. Smech gooin. It was a bear that you shot. What did you shoot? It was a bear that you shot. There. Well, gooey would be I shot a bear. I'm talking about you. No, I'm using the you. I know it's often, it's easy to get, that's another thing about doing field work in linguistics. Words like you and I, quite often with older people I'll say, how do you say I shot it? And they'll give you the sentence back, you shot it, because they think that I is me, right? And because you see, words like I and you and so forth, they change their meaning every time the speaker changes in a conversation. They really, those pronouns stand for themselves. They're what's called indexical rather than anaphoric. I'll just put this for the linguist. Those pronouns are indexical pronouns. They are not anaphoric pronouns. Okay, now I want to set the cat amongst the pigeons with you and look at a focus structure that you might think would involve a verb. If we say, he or she wants some rice, he or she wants some rice, hasakt miyub, hasakt miyub. Hasak, want, the T is the he or she, the th connective. It's th because miyub is a common noun. Hasak miyub. Okay, now if we want to focus miyub, you know, what does he want? It's rice he wants. All we have to do is just miyub hasakt. Okay, it's rice that he wants. Now, well, so I want to set the cat amongst the pigeons there. Try to show you now that even though we translate this as a verb in English, he wants rice, she wants rice. Rice is what he wants, rice is what she wants. That even though want is a verb in English, it's not a verb in Somali. Similarly, the construction which is we u or we o, to love or like. If you tell somebody you like them or love them, we u nin, I love you. That it too is not a verb. What I'm saying is that words like hasak and we u are not really verbs in Somali, but they are nouns. And if you were to give a literal translation, I'm going to try to prove it to you in a minute. If you want to give a literal translation, this is not really I want, but it is her desire or her want is rice. We ui nin. The literal translation is not literally I love you, but you are my love. My love is you. My liking, the object of my desire. You are the object of my desire, which is dressing it up a little bit too much. There. But if you check, see, if this was a verb, it's got to be a transitive verb, because you see you have a verb there, and you have the transitive, well, just imagine, transitive verb, and then you have the transitive subject here, and transitive object here. You know, in terms of the ordering, it looks right. The only thing that's wrong is that whenever you have a transitive verb with a third person singular subject, you have to have a vowel following the last consonant of the stem. Notice right here, it's gubi and guwin. I ate gubi, gubin, you ate gubit, not gooped. Gooped is a dependent order construction. In other words, you have that vowel. So that if this were truly a transitive verb, it should inflect like a verb. What I'm telling you is that hasak doesn't behave like a verb. We doesn't behave like a verb in Somali. they behave like nouns, so that, we give them verb translations in English, but if you tell somebody, if you're teaching somebody that hasak and wi'u is a verb in Somalia, then they're going to inflect them the wrong way. And does hasagat mi'u mean anything? No. See, where I treat hasak exactly the way I do goop and goo. I put the vowel after it. Hasagat mi'u just doesn't sound right. Now how about if I put, the yi in there that you would expect following the vowel, we, u, yi, nin, make a verb out of it. Like we have giba, giba yi. Well, we u yi, nin, we u yi, nin. Sound okay? No. Sounds terrible, or it sounds broken. You might be able to get some meaning from it. But to finish up before we take our break right now, this is sort of a tangent, it's not directly germane to focusing, although I showed you how you focus with hasak now. You just take the this is really the intransitive subject, and this is a possessor right here. Her wish is for rice, or her wish is rice, her want is rice. But what I've been trying to do to you, or trying to show you here, is that words like hasak and wi'u behave like nouns, not like verbs. And remember what I've been telling you all along is you don't want to try to fit your language to English, but when we talk about it linguistically, whether we're talking about the sounds or the parts of speech or the different construction patterns for sentences, we want to be true to the language itself. We don't want to fit it to make it like English when it really isn't. So that when we make up a dictionary entry and we put hasak in it, which is a very important word, it's one you hear all the time, for its part of speech class membership, it's going to be a noun, even though it translates into English as a verb, a transitive verb. Similarly, for wi'u, when we make up a dictionary entry for it, we're going to say that it's a noun, even though it translates as a transitive verb in English. When you go back over this, reviewing your notes or looking at the videotape, I think it'll become clear to you. But this is the way that linguists work, by the way. So essentially what I've been trying to do is to give you what we would call a proof that hasak and wi'u are nouns, not verbs. So it's no good for me to just say, look, this is the way it is, and you accept it because I say that way. What I attempt to do is to give you a proof. I say, look, if it really is a verb, then it should behave like other verbs, like goop and goo. And it doesn't. Instead, it behaves like all the nouns. Therefore, these words must be nouns. And if we're going to describe them truly and correctly in the dictionary, we have to say they're nouns. About the indigenous tradition of language study, which isn't an academic sort of study, but is extremely important, knowledge of the names and ayuks and adauch and so forth, and ways of speaking. Then I talked about the missionary Christian tradition, and I was pretty critical of it because I see it as having played a significant role in bringing about language shift. But I want to say to you again that when I was critical of the missionary tradition, I was not being critical of the missionaries' religion or their Christianity. It was just of what, as I see it, the confusion of Christianity with British civilization or with Western civilization. And then I began to move on to the linguistic anthropology part, or the work done by linguists and anthropologists. And I started back with Franz Boas, and then mentioned Edward Sapir, his student, told you about a bit about Marius Barbeau. And I said that with Marius Barbeau, you have to be aware that most of his work was not done by himself, that you really have to consider it, most of his work, you have to look at it in terms of Barbeau's relationship with William Bainan, who was a Tsimshan man who spoke Tsimshanam and did a tremendous amount of work, and often isn't given credit for it. And he worked not only for Barbeau, but he worked for Boas too in the 1930s. I'll come back to Bainan a bit more. But as I moved on down to the present day, where I'm talking about people who are basically my colleagues, you know, there's people who, if I don't teach with them in the same institution, I might go there and visit, or, you know, we see each other at meetings, we know each other, we keep in touch by mail and so forth. And it puts me in an invidious position to talk about other people's work, at least publicly, and particularly if I'm critical or so forth. But nevertheless, I think it's important to tell you what I know about who did work here, so that you can then get copies of their materials. You can take advantage of it for yourselves. You can make it your own material. And if you look at the back of my dictionary, at the back of my grammar, there's a big, long bibliography of references, and there's many unpublished sources in there that are worth trying to get, from the National Museum, or the Tribal Council has lots, or if there's anything that you can't get in touch with me. I think I certainly have realized that the amount of work that's been done in the last 100 years on Gitksan people, their language and so forth, as well as the neighboring Niska and Tsimshan peoples, is a huge amount of material. And although there are few of us on the ground in the academic world who work in it, it's a field that there's a body of material there, both on the record as well as, you know, the living tradition, which you guys are part of today, which, you know, can easily support university lectureships or university professorship. You know, it's a separate field, and in fact, those of us who work in the field call ourselves Tsimshianists, and that term actually comes from the name of the language family. It's not that we all work with the Tsimshan people, but that the four different languages belong to a family which is called Tsimshianic or Tsimshianic. And there have been various conferences. Margaret Anderson, whom I'll mention in a few minutes, in 1987, I think it was, ran a conference at Hartley Bay, and there was people who worked on the language and culture and history. And there was a conference before that in the 70s sometime, and there's two books that have come out that are books in Tsimshianic studies. You know, people like Marie-Françoise Guédon and Margaret Anderson and others have written in.
Was that William Bainan white?
No, William Bainan was a Tsimshan man. His father might have been on Siwa.
Some of his work, I think.
He lived at Port Edward.
Yeah.
All right, did you know him? He lived at Port Edward.
But I mean, some of his work on our, try to do something on our tribe, and a lot of it made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
The wolves and the frogs are in the same tribe. He didn't know that when we call Wixawit.
Yeah. Yeah. I was saying about him yesterday that, if I remember correctly, he learned Tsimshian not as a child growing up, but I think he learned it when he was a young man or a teenager. But I've been told that he spoke it fairly well, but he didn't speak the Gitksan or Nistai languages. He could understand.
He tried to write on our Adao, and it's all wrong.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that got me to thinking yesterday, and at the end somebody said, well, what about Cathy Hunt? And I realized that I had left Cathy out because, well, for one thing, I'm going by my 1986 manuscript, and she was just beginning her work then. So I've actually written down a number of names, and I'll go over them with you this morning to tell you a bit. And before I come back to Gitksan, I'll talk a bit about other people who've worked more recently on Tsimshian. In the late 1960s, starting about 1968, I think it was, or 1969, a young man named John Dunn started work at Gitksan and at Prince Rupert, studying the Coast Tsimshian language, and he wrote his dissertation, got his PhD, I think it was about 1971 at the University of New Mexico. He was my very first PhD student. I was his supervisor. I introduced him and supervised his work. And over the years, he's kept that work up. He's the man who, the white fellow, not the native person, who discovered this skuch, this southern Tsimshian language there. Other people who've worked on the coast, other linguists, would include Gene Mulder, who I've mentioned, who worked first at Numatlakatla in Alaska, and then worked at Hartley Bay on Tsimshian, and then worked for several years in Prince Rupert in their Tsimagach language program. She was, she worked for several years in the education system at Prince Rupert, helping to develop teaching materials in Tsimshian language. And she was just here 2 weeks ago doing some consulting for the Kispiak School. She has a continuing interest in the language, and also she's moving to Australia the end of the month, so that there'll be 2 Tsimshianists in Australia from the first of the year. Another person, and I've mentioned articles that Gene has written on, Village English. John Dunn, Neil has a copy of his Tsimshian dictionary. The other person who I should mention, who's a linguist and an anthropologist, was formerly known by her then married name, Margaret Anderson. She's an anthropologist and linguist who's worked for many years at Hartley Bay, and in fact married a Hartley Bay man. Her name is now Margaret Anderson. I forget her husband's name. Her husband's name.
Clarence.
Pardon?
Clarence.
Clarence. Okay, Clarence Anderson.
My wife's cousin.
Yeah, and she's now the director of the Native Studies program at UNBC. And I'm sure she's been through here, and you'll see lots of her. I had a good long talk with her the other day about the program here, and and what a very good job Art and other people are doing in your program, your training program, and in the immersion program. But these are people who've done linguistic work in Tsimshian language, and who also have interests in Ganem, even if they haven't worked in it. They're interested, and they read my papers and other people's papers. There's also a cultural anthropologist whom I haven't met, but I've talked with him on the phone, and I've read some of his papers, named Jim McDonald, who's from UBC in anthropology, and most of his work has been with the Gitksan people at Gitksan or Gitksan Kaelin. Got it, thank you. He's not a linguist, and there's another linguist, Anglican priest named Derek something or other who, I won't put his name on the board, but years ago he did work on the Gitksan Tsimshan language, but he's never written it up or shared it with other people there. For Nisqa, see, what we're getting here for the non-native people, there was a pattern, you know, where there was a bit of work done at the turn of the century and in the 1920s, maybe the 30s. Then it wasn't until the 60s and 70s that the anthropologists and linguists started working here again. And to move to the Nisqa people, there was a cultural anthropologist from Bryn Mawr College, Steve McNary, who in the early 1970s worked over on the Nass River, mainly at Greenville and Ayance, and wrote his thesis, his PhD dissertation on the Nisqa at Bryn Mawr College for his PhD. He now works in a bank. He's not doing anthropological work anymore, but the Nisqa people have copies of his work and have made use of it. They've gone quite farther beyond that. Linguists, after myself, I said I started work myself in Nisqa in 1966, and I was there and did some more in 67, 68, and I've been back other times. But after me, well, in 1975, 74, 75, when they took control of the school board for themselves, and they asked me if I would come working for them, and I said I can't because I'm going to Australia. They hired a young woman named Linda Walsh, and Linda worked for them for about 2 years, I think, did a quite good job, and then she left and went on to do a master's and a PhD, I think maybe at Ottawa, or somewhere in the east. And about 1977, Marie-Lucie Tarpon moved to Ayance with the fellow she was then married to, and she was a trained linguist, and she took up work on Nisqa, and she was there more or less continuously in the period up to about 1983, 84, something like that, maybe a bit later. And she's been back a number of summers, but she wrote her PhD thesis on Nisqa grammar at the University of Victoria. It's a big, you know, it's like 800 pages. It's even bigger than my Gitksan grammar. And she's the person who helped train, was it Verna Robinson? And there's about a half dozen younger Nisqa ladies who are really good at reading and writing the language and at curriculum development and so forth. But it was Marie-Lucie who worked with them. They're all about the same age, and she speaks the language really quite fluently and well and knows it well. But she, of course, has a good Nisqa accent. But if you heard her speak, you wouldn't have any trouble following her at all. She speaks very well. And I'd have to say that if you think that I know our Simalgit well, Marie-Lucie knows theirs better than I know ours there. I mean, she's been working at it longer, and she's really done a very intense study. Linda has continued her work, and she was at UBC a couple of years ago as a postdoctoral fellow, and again, she's written more, but I've not read any new stuff, any new material by her. Well, to come back to linguists and anthropologists who worked on Gitksan specifically, yesterday we were talking about Marie-Françoise Guédon and Rosalind Wally, who first came with her, and then Rosalind worked on her own. But the other person who I should have mentioned there, whom Rosalind worked with and who has long-term interests here, is Marjorie Halpin, who is still, I think, at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. And Marjorie wrote a PhD dissertation 20 years or so ago. It's a great big thick thing, and what it's important for, I know the Tribal Council has a copy, but it's a good study of the different Ayuks, of the different crests for Tsimshan, Nisqa, and Gitksan. It's a very valuable piece of material, and it's based not only in some of our own field work, but going through Barbeau and Duff and older people's work. And Marjorie also wrote a biography of William Bainan. It's just a short little article, about 15, 20 pages, but it was Marjorie who, as it were, rescued William Bainan from the obscurity that Barbeau had put him in. You know, Barbeau never gave him proper credit. So Marjorie wrote this little biographical article. And again, Marjorie, I understand, has just taken a position at UNBC, so she'll be moving there, and I expect you'll probably see something of her over the next few years. The other person who I'll mention is an anthropologist and not a linguist. Marjorie is not, none of these people, well, Rosalind is a linguist and anthropologist, but these other people are just anthropologists. But another anthropologist who worked here, I think, in the 70s and the 80s is John Cove. Some of you may know him at Carleton University, which is in Ottawa. Yeah. And he's published a couple of books. I can't think of the name of his main book, but more recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, he published 2 thick volumes of William Bainan's texts, you know, the materials that Bainan collected, the ones that are in Ottawa, I recall, not the ones that are in Columbia University, although I could be corrected on that. I may need to be. I may not be absolutely correct. And then Richard is, to my knowledge, the latest in the line of anthropologists to work here, being hired by the Tribal Council to work on the case and then continuing on his own. So I better put your name on the board, Richard, just to give you equal treatment. The next person, or the last, some of you may wonder about Jay Powell. I'll talk about Jay Powell, who's an anthropologist and linguist, in just a few minutes in connection with education. I'm not trying to leave him out. I just want to put him in that particular category. But yesterday, some of you were asking me about Cathy Hunt, who is a linguist. She's a student, or was a student in linguistics at University of British Columbia. Must have started about the mid-1980s. She's from my part of the world. She's a Kiwi from New Zealand, so when we've been together before, we can talk our kind of English and understand one another. But she currently is teaching at Fresno, at California State University in Fresno, teaching linguistics. I think Joan did a course with her a few years ago where they did some linguistics. But she's writing her PhD thesis on Gitksan syntax. So the things that we've been talking about here are the things that she's writing about. She's using a slightly different theoretical perspective than me, so that while we cover some of the same material, she looks at it a bit differently. Some things she goes into a bit more deeply than I do, but we keep in fairly close touch. She originally began her work with people from Kippenkool, and Phyllis, you were one of the first people she worked with, if I remember right. And then over the years, as she stayed in Vancouver and some people left, she switched over. In more recent years, she's worked more with Barbara Sennett, and you, Margaret, have worked with her too. There. And she's a person whom I would give a strong recommendation to, to get her involved in this work, as well as Rosalind. I'll give Rosalind a strong recommendation too, that you need, or we need, all the help we can get, because we're in this together. And we'll continue to talk about what we, about planning, what sort of needs we have. So that completes the linguistic anthropological stream. Let me move to the educational or pedagogical stream of Gitksan language work. And I told you that there was an early current that began in the last century, in the late 1880s, or probably in the 1890s, here in Gitwangach by Reverend Price, that he printed materials, he had a primer, he taught children and presumably also adults to read and write here in the village, and that there was a period 80 or 90 years ago when there was a lot of literacy in Somalia amongst the Christian people at least. But that particular stream of educational work in Somalia ended by World War I, when Reverend Price left. I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think it continued on after he left. And certainly the missionaries, as a general rule, used Somali only so long, only in the early stages. Once the children got good English, adults began to speak English well, they moved on into English because they thought English was the language of civilization. But this educational current, or educational stream, I would say began again in the late 1960s. About 1967 it would have been, maybe 68, when Sarah Hindle and I started working together. We actually met one another in 1966 and did a bit of work together, but it would have been about 67 or 68. Sally said, look, I want to learn to read and write my own language. I appreciate what you're doing, but I'd like to, read and write it myself. She had done work with John Adams and Alice Kazakov, so she had an idea of what anthropologists and linguists do. And so then I had to start thinking about, well, how are we going to write Gitksan? How are we going to write Somalia? Because, you see, I had been using a technical alphabet. I'd been using phonetic symbols in my work. Instead of writing K underline, I used a Q. Instead of writing TS apostrophe, I used a C with an apostrophe over it. Instead of HL, I used L with a bar through it. Instead of TL apostrophe, I used the Greek lambda, like that, with these kinds of symbols. And at first, I tried to teach her, the technical linguistic symbols. But they were strange and unfamiliar, and it became obvious soon on that that was not the way to go, that made the language seem even more removed and esoteric, you know, by writing it using strange symbols, so that it became obvious that that we should move to use only letters from the English alphabet and characters that are found on a standard keyboard, and try to, you know, to be true to the spirit of the language, but yet to use familiar symbols and so forth. So, following on then, Lonnie Hindle, Sally's oldest son, came to the University of New Mexico in 1970 for the 1970-71 academic year. As I think I've told you before, he hadn't graduated from the high school here because of the racist treatment that used to be given to students. It was really quite rare for native students to graduate in those days. Couldn't get into UBC, but we managed to get him into the University of New Mexico. He came down and the dean interviewed him, and he did very well there in 70 and 71. But he and I became very close. We call one another WEC, and we started doing language work together, and it was Lonnie and me who developed this new alphabet. We borrowed some ideas from a man named Randy Bouchard, who had been doing work in the South. But it was Lonnie and me who together developed this new alphabet. And, you know, we were trying to, you know, to be true to the spirit of the language, but yet not to make it look strange and unfamiliar. Alice?
The other linguistic linguists, did they follow your idea, or did they follow their own, like on the alphabet there?
The way it's worked out is that all the other linguists who've worked up here since then, well, specifically say Jay Powell and Rosalind and Cathy Hunt, who else? And most of the anthropologists, John Dunn, they've all used, you know, essentially the Hindle-Rigsby alphabet. I mean, to use that name just to put our name on what I prefer to call the new symbolic alphabet. And we first presented it up here in the summer of 1971 when the Gitksan Association, essentially the Gitksan Association bought me a ticket, or paid, as I recall, yeah, bought me an air ticket return from Albuquerque to come up, and we gave a one-week workshop down at Gitksan, and Russell Stevens was there, as well as I think Pearl Trombley may have been there, and some other people. It would have been a dozen, maybe 24 people over a week's time. That was where the new alphabet got launched. Then this people, I wouldn't say they got wind of it, I was probably writing to people then, but in November 1971, Bert McKay, Bill McKay, who's now dead, but was at that time the head chief of Greenville, and Hubert McMillan came down to the University of New Mexico in November 1971 for a week. We stopped at my house for about 3 or 4 days, and I taught them the new alphabet, just showing it to them, because they were really excited about, you know, there's a new way to write our language, and we want, you know, to get control of the schools, and we want our language taught and so forth. And I can remember we spent 3 days, you know, like 8 hours a day, just me showing it to them and demonstrating it, and they were satisfied that it was a good way. Hubert, of course, had worked with me before. Hubert McMillan is the person who's taught me the most that I know about Nispam. And then we went out to the Navajo reservation for 3 days. I had a pickup truck with a camper on the back, and 2 people riding in the front and two in the back. But we visited Rough Rock School and Rock Point School, and I had some students out there. One of my students was principal at Rock Point, and another PhD student was working at Rough Rock. And they saw Navajo people teaching their own language in the school. All the stuff, on the walls was in Navajo language. They went to a school board meeting where there wasn't any English spoken, and they said, look, we got to do this. And so they moved then over the next few years to take control of their education. And then I went to Australia in 1972, but for a month in June and July of 1973, the Nisqually people, it was Bert and Alvin McKay, asked me to come up, and I gave, I think it was a 3-week-long workshop. 3-week-long workshop. Group about like this, and again, teaching the new alphabet, teaching a bit of grammar, and just getting across to them that yes, it's possible to write the language. It has a grammar. You should be thinking about putting it into the schools, and this is one way to do it. You shouldn't just think of oral presentation, but you need the reading and writing literacy with it. I moved to Australia. Well, I was there for the whole year in 72, and then I went back again briefly in 74, and then I moved there in mid-75, so that for some years I was sort of out of things here because I was settling in there and didn't get back here till 81. But by the mid-1970s, there was a local movement here in the Gitksan homeland to introduce bicultural and bilingual education materials, curriculum materials into the school. And I think there are 3 important factors in that local building up and development of work and education here. One was the development of Gitksan Village and the development of, the group of artists and performers there in the early 1970s. I think the little dictionary that Lonnie and I published had a bit of an effect. And then the National Indian Brotherhood issued a document on local native control of education, which, gave, national prominence to the idea that local indigenous people, native people themselves, should be controlling and organizing their education. But Gitksan in those days was very important. The guides, the artists, and performers did a lot to really develop the public image of the Gitksan people by providing non-Gitksan people with views of a very rich and vibrant continuing culture. The old view was that it was all dead and, to be seen only in museums. And with Gitksan, it was obvious that wasn't the case. When you could see people dancing, when you could see the marvelous jewelry and carving and so forth, that it was alive there. And then there was, the development of the courses for training artists and so forth. Another person who I want to mention who was important in the 70s for educational development was Susan Marsden, who I'm sure you all know, who was a curriculum developer for the local provincial school board. Did she work here particularly in Gitksan? But she cooperated with the Gitksan artists and other local people.
She'll be back right after you leave in January. She'll be here.
Good, good. But she prepared a number of English curriculum packages in the mid-70s, like Birds of Gitksan and Tsimshian Stories, and audio-visual packages. And she collected, a lot of the existing published stuff and put it into shape for use in the schools. And she also gave workshops for non-native school teachers to orientate them, people who were coming in to teach, to orient them towards what they were coming to so that they would have respect and better understanding of local culture and tradition. To talk a bit about the Hindle and Rigsby dictionary, that was published in 1973. Lonnie and I wrote most of it in 1971, and then I was away in all 1972, but if you recall looking at the preface, I read the proofs when I was in Australia, and the address, it says Bruce Rigsby, Cape York Peninsula, Australia, on it. But that dictionary was published in 1973, and copies of it were distributed without charge to many people. And here I want to pay tribute to the late Bernard Hindle and to Sarah Hindle, Sally Hindle, who put up some few $100s of their own money from their own pocket to print that dictionary, and then it was distributed without charge to the local schools and to people who wanted it. However, and they need to be given that credit. The dictionaries were never sold. They never made any money from it. To my knowledge, Sally Hindle's never received money for the work that she's done on the language. I think maybe, well, she got a small amount once working with J. Powell, and I've paid her small amounts over the years, but most of the time the work she's done with me has been out of her sense of commitment to the language and making sure that it's documented. But the dictionary really wasn't suitable for use as a school primer. And I think it probably, for many people, was an object of curiosity and maybe some frustration, looking at the words spelled strangely and trying to figure out why does he use those X's, what do the underlines stand for, and so forth then. But nevertheless, I think it helped promote the image of the language to non-Gitksan people, and to Gitksan people it helped, strengthen the idea that the language could be written and that it was worthy of study and so forth in the same way as English or other languages. Russell Stevens, who taught Gitksan language at Hazleton at the high school in 76 to 78, made some use of the dictionary in his lessons, and Russell had been had done the workshop with Lonnie and me in 1971, and Russell and I have been good friends from '66. We used to Sildax together, or is it Sildax? And we used to squat. We used to squat together too. Yeah, silt. But there was an obvious need then in the, after 1975, about 77 or so, for Gitksan curriculum materials. And so the Kispiox Band Council, as a result of pressure from Gitksan people and from non-Gitksan staff, the Kispiox School contracted with J. Powell and I think and his wife, Vicki Jensen, to prepare teaching materials to be used in the schools. Jay is like myself. He's both an anthropologist and a linguist and worked in other languages and had actually more experience than myself in applied linguistic work. His wife, Vicki, is a professional photographer, but I think also trained as a teacher in curriculum development.
Where are they now?
Well, Jay actually is teaching a course similar to this down at Prince Rupert on Simsalmon just right now. Margaret was telling me the other day.
I was accepted into that program and I had to
But Jay and Vicki prepared, you know, the 2 series of Gitksan language teaching materials for the Kispiak school or school board. They also provided a series of 4 Western Gitksan language teaching books for Kitwin-Kul, Gitksa, and Gitwin-Gach bands, which were used here after they were produced. They're professionally, they're professionally packaged and have excellent photographs in them. I can't really appraise them from the standpoint of educational pedagogy, you know, from the standpoint of curriculum, content, and so forth. I've read through them and find them very interesting, and I've learned some things from them. Jay, while he uses the same spelling system that I do, sometimes he and I spell words differently. So Jay and Vicki did quite a bit of work early in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There were other people who taught Gitksan language classes in those years too, in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Randy Adams, who was at Kitwin-Kul, and then here, Edith Gatwa at Kispiaks, Olive Mulwayne, and Matilda Wilson at Gitksa. Fern taught for a number of years at Kispiaks, Brenda Stewart, Albert Wilson here, was it? Did Albert teach here? Barbara Sennett taught at Northwest Community College in 1982, and she's taught more recently down in Vancouver. And all these people have made use of the Hindle and Rigsby dictionary and the Powell and Johnson materials. Nevertheless, in 1981, when I came back in 1981, and Jay was still working, there was a certain amount of frustration that Jay and I both were aware of, that the teachers were concerned about themselves not being able to read and write easily and rapidly. People were still having trouble with writing, a bit more easy to read, and concerned with the materials that were available, which either had mistakes in them or had other problems. And so Jay and I both then videotaped materials. In 1981, Jay videotaped presentations on his language teaching methods as used in the Gitksan for Kids series. Then in early 1982, when I was here, I gave a 3-day workshop at Gitksa, and that was videotaped. And again, I gave a 1 or 2 evening series at Northwest Community College that was videotaped. And those videotapes that Jay and I made on separate occasions were meant to try to support and help this educational stream come along again. And it's really been, since then, over the last 10 years, it's been you people here carrying the work on yourselves without a great deal of help from the outside. I was back in '86, and I spent, I think, one afternoon talking to the people who were in the interpreters course, but my primary focus was helping, you know, on the land claim case. And I don't think Jay has been back since then. But essentially, we come down to the present day where, Gwes has very strong interests now in language. Gitwin-Gach, your school here, has not only strong interest, but you've made a strong commitment with your immersion program and the teacher training program that Art is principal instructor in. And you asked me to come, and we're here doing this now.
Because people don't recognize, like they say that we're not certified, so therefore
we have no say in anything.
That's an important point, and one that you, to use a fancy word, you need to contest. You need to reject that and argue every time. And just in that regard, Margaret Anderson, I talked the other day about the course and university credit for it. The work that we've done in this course is of the same quality, the same standard of difficulty as you will get in any good university in the world. Don't mean to boast or skite, but I've been a university teacher for many years. I've taught at many universities, and I haven't cut any corners with you. I haven't watered the material down. I have packaged it so that it's oriented towards some Algech rather than English. And I've seen arts materials, we've talked about that. While Art teaches differently than me, he uses a culturally appropriate style. The things, the content, the culture, the heritage, the history that Art talks about, again, in its quality, it's the same that you would get in a university if you were studying anthropology or European history or whatever. And I've told Margaret that, and she appreciates it because she's a very sensitive person. But I think you need constantly to contest to get credit and proper recognition for your relevant experience and knowledge, so that you're not just taken in at the bottom rung. Because over the long run, you can't depend on Siwa coming in. You remember? They're like toots. Si wildet, they piked, and then they fly away again. It's Gitksan people who will be here, and in that regard, I want also to say something else that often doesn't get said, is that all human cultures and societies naturalize people. None are closed. I was born and raised in America, but I'm an Australian citizen now, and my children are Australians, and my grandchildren will be Australians. There are Siwa who come here and who, by developing relationships or simply being here, get naturalized, and they're not blow-ins. They're not like the birds there, and you should make use of them. Yes, Phyllis.
How could universities do the dissertation on Gitksan language, and yet the languages don't really recognize the Gitksan language?
Like Nishka?
Or even French, or...
Well, if you did your degree in a linguistics department or even an education department, it would be recognized, Phyllis. What's important there is the quality of the research work that you do and having a supervisor who can oversight it. But you see, people like yourselves, who's a native speaker, you're 10 years ahead, you know, from the start of a non-speaker there. But it's quite possible for you to do a master's or a PhD on your own language or your own tradition, but you do need to get somebody who can provide you with supervision. But the universities are willing to recognize, for purposes of research, for getting degrees, to recognize the language and the culture. There's no problem. Where the problems that Fern was alluding to and I was talking about before is with the primary and secondary education system, and, you know, the certification of teachers and recognition of qualifications. I'm probably not the best person to talk about that. I would imagine Joan would have, you know, experience and could talk at greater length than I could about that.
I'm talking about the school districts, though. The school district just recognizes French as a second language. And yet the students from the BBC or any other university use a sign language.
learning in Poet Language 3, the ministry is made an announcement that they will use French at year 5. And in brackets, they put First Nations languages
Yeah.
and use French.
Yeah.
And along with that announcement, it's not in writing yet, on the secondary courses to be accredited. So it would be possible to put the course together for Gitksan language. Maybe not in 93, but hopefully 94.
Yes.
Would be the beginning of Gitksan language for secondary as well as the common school. But it will be recognized.
Good.
In the next couple of years.
Good.
Hopefully something will be worked out. That's what happens. And part of the reason why it's not organized yet is we're doing it under run. We can't complete things under run. That's where it's not very hard.
It's difficult, but it's extremely important, so that what you were pointing out, Phyllis, there's a discrepancy between, you know, that the non-native students can use the language for their degrees, yet the language isn't recognized locally by the school board. Well, as Joan was saying, that's changing. And this then it's one of those critical times in history where if you don't, what is the term, carpe diem, if you don't seize the day and grab the opportunities and develop your own curriculum materials, get your teachers trained like we're doing here now, you lose the opportunity.
See, another thing that your own people are saying is that you're not certified, so therefore you're not qualified to get what money you're supposed to get. It's really frustrating, you know, trying to working your ass off and not really getting paid for it, you know, what you're worth.
Yeah, I understand that, and you know, I know that I have heard, you know, that there are people, Gitksan people, who basically don't agree with what we've been doing here, who think it's more important for their children to learn French than it is for them to learn their own language because they'll get a better job, or you know, can go off to Vancouver or Edmonton and so forth. I have my views on that, you know what they are, and I know what your views are.
Yeah, we had a school board meeting when we started off. That's a couple of guys stood up and says, do you guarantee them to become doctors? And what school can guarantee that? There are some out there.
They could become, like the
I guarantee that.
Or that we could do easily.
But again, to repeat some of the material that I talked about, some of the things I said to you early on, is, you know, this is a critical time now where there are several generations of people, let's say from age 40 on down, who have, for various reasons or another, not their fault, missed out on getting the full language. Went away to residential school, lost it, their parents didn't speak it to them, or they made choices, you know, not to continue to speak it after they left childhood and so forth. So that if things were just left that way, we could predict that, you know, the language would simply disappear, that children will learn English and they won't learn Somali. What the school here and at Hazelton and at other places want to do is to recapture the children, to regain control, language control, over this generation of children and succeeding generations of children by using an immersion program based primarily in the school, so that the children get some Alga as well as English, and they get it in a good, warm, positive, supportive environment. But and we talked also about the importance, the relevance of the Maori people's language nest program, where it's a sort of preschool program where even before the children go to school, they go in like to a preschool from age 3 or so into what? Good. Well, it's exactly that model there where you capture them. But the point I want to make is that while the school is important in, strengthening the language, getting it onto the radio and the television a bit, putting signs up, road signs and that sort of thing. I mean, not just here in the school, but put it out there in public. All of those things are important for raising the status of the language, and the school's important for helping to recapture the kids. But ultimately, you have to get into the home and the local community where children come to see the language as not just something to learn at school, but it's something that they speak on the playground. It's something that they hear their parents use when they talk to their neighbors, or that you use when you go to the local shop, so forth. That it's on a par with English in that respect. Otherwise, the school alone can't save the language.
They used to have that in Gitksan too, with the 2- and 3-year-olds. Now they did away with it. I don't know why, but they don't have it anymore.
Well, it's in many ways, if you've had the 2-year-olds or the young people, the young kids like that, had them for a couple of years and got them fluent, and then stopped teaching them, it's like squandering. It's like squandering wealth. The Maori people had the same problems, that the kids come out of the nest into the public schools and get only 2 or 3 hours a week. And so they've insisted that they get sufficient Maori language in order to keep their Maori up and to develop it even further. Because children are learning. I mean, a 5 or 6-year-old may be fluent in the language in the same way they're fluent in English. But in English they have to learn new vocabulary, more complicated grammar, and they learn history and so forth. And there's no reason to expect that Gitksan children learning Samotic shouldn't do the same thing. Charlotte.
When we're on the subject of children, I'd just like to share my grandchildren's compliments when they heard that I was taking up the culture and language immersion program. And one of them commented, "Oh, it's a straight Indian now,
There's one more straight Indian. There's one more bit of comparative material I want to raise with you that I think might be of some interest. It may be controversial, I don't know, but I'll raise it. I tell you about situations like the Maori and in Australia and so forth, or the history of English, not just to talk, but because I think that information is relevant. We can take it and learn something and use it here. But in both America and in Canada, there are several religious groups whose religious convictions are very strong, so that they often have difficulty, or they're not completely willing to turn their kids over to the mainstream school system. And these also are groups who don't speak English. English is not their native language. And I'm talking about people who in America, mainly in western Pennsylvania, but also Ohio and Indiana, who are called the Amish. And here in Canada, you have Mennonites. They live in what are basically closed communities. They speak not standard German amongst themselves, but they speak German dialects. And non-standard German. And they do have schools. They often run their own schools, and they teach the kids standard German there enough, to read the Bible and prayers and so forth. And there are other things, they don't get involved in the mainstream in the same way that, often don't use refrigerators or motor cars and so forth. But so I'm not suggesting to you that you should become closed communities and shut yourselves in like the Mennonites and the Amish. But I do suggest that it's worth looking to read about them, to learn about them, to see what they've done that's enabled them to be so successful for over 300 or 400 years, surrounded by English speakers or Russian speakers when they lived out in eastern Russia and so forth, to keep their own language going at the same time as having bilingualism. Now, they don't have literacy in their own non-standard German. The kids get literacy in standard German, and then, I don't know, they may use it for their own German, but, they've been able to keep their language and culture and society going, even though they've been surrounded by other kinds of white people. I think I'll break at this point.